With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Keith Atkinson from the Forest Practices Board to join us on stage for a 20-minute fireside chat with Dallas Smith. There won't be a Q&A for this one, but please just keep your phones ready for the panel that's coming right after that. Thank you.
Good point. Where's the fire, he says. I think I am a little fired up today, but in a sort of relaxed, I won't say tired. So, really appreciate you coming out today, Keith. You know, you and I have crossed paths, you know, in different jobs, different positions, but we've always sort of had the same goal, and that's ensuring that First Nations values and opportunities get the best opportunity that they can get. And I've been in awe watching you just travel around and apply your skills and knowledge in so many different places. But frankly, I'm going to say I got confused with your latest role. So why don't you introduce yourself and your current, well, some of your previous roles, but let's get into your current role, the one that befuddles me a little bit. But I really look forward to this.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Dallas. It's my pleasure to be here to join the conference. It's really a pleasure to come home. I'm a Nanwakolas member, so on behalf of our community, welcome everybody today to your last day of your conference. Yeah, my career's, I've had the pleasure of an opportunity to work with a number of different paths in my career as an Indigenous forester. And this last one, joining the Forest Practices Board, is different. I didn't think I would apply for a government job at this stage of my career. I've spent over 11 years with the First Nations Forestry Council, as you know, advocating and supporting First Nations around the province in the issues of forestry, the business of forestry, advancing that economic development opportunity, but also wanting to stand up our governance rights and title recognition so that we can introduce in a more direct way our values and interests on the land. And you know, times have changed. All of that work with leaders in our communities over the years have advanced our position in our relationship and recognition by the province and what's going on, to a point where the province unanimously supported the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And that high-level mandate is an opportunity that opens that door clearly that we need now to do the work of implementing it. I was definitely drawn to that opportunity. I was drawn to having learned from so many First Nations leaders about their interests and what we're trying to achieve in forestry, knowing I'm very proud of being a professional forester in the province of BC. It's interesting that there's this global recognition for how well we do forestry in British Columbia, but it's not aligned with First Nations because the perspective of an individual First Nation in their territory doesn't necessarily match that greatness of managing for values. I've shifted the Forest Practices Board. It's an independent watchdog, so we're not part of any ministry. We're part of the funded by the public of BC, and we're there to. It's 28 years now. It was established back in the time when there was a war in the woods in Clayoquot, written into the forest policy legislated mandate to be an independent look at how well forests are being managed through their forest practices. So we're required to audit licensees so their compliance with the forestry laws of BC. If the public member complains to us about they think there's something wrong with forest practices, we'll investigate that, and we must do that. We go out and do that, and we publicly report back, and sometimes with recommendations that need to be addressed. And so that's a very powerful, independent monitoring role. We don't have the teeth. We're not finding anybody. We're not actually punitive in that regard. But the goal is to improve forest practices on the ground. Our reports with recommendations might lead to changes in policy that improve how we do things in the province. And the other goal is to get public's support. We need the public to see that things are working properly in the province. So the War in the Woods was a time when the society said, no, it's not working. We got to do stuff. We became that watchdog. The forest practices changed, as you know, from a Forest Practices Code model to a Forest and Range Practices Act, which we're now working within. It's supposed to be an adaptive management model. A lot of our work talks about how do we adapt. And now is a time when adapting is critical. We recognize some strong issues with climate change affecting the forests, a history of trying to do the best thing in forest management by putting out fires, resulting in fuel accumulation that's causing some devastating fires. We need to adapt. We have to shift our forest management. And so I was pretty excited to get an opportunity, throw my name in the hat, and they actually chose me. So here I am, going to try and help make that change.
You know, I think that's awesome. That shows the evolution of us integrating these things. I mean, you and I have been doing this a long time. I remember when Mike DeYoung, I think it was at a meeting in Richmond, and I believe Robert Dennis was there. This is early in the Liberals' new mandate back in the early 2000s, and we started talking about revenue sharing and forest licenses for First Nations. They're all, non-renewable, and they weren't really getting us anywhere, but they were a starting point. But I think that's one thing that made us realize the accountability that exists within the forest industry in British Columbia. I know one of our partners on one of our joint ventures had an audit, and there were some findings that were a little concerning to me as a community member for something that was being done in my territory. But then the part of me was like, well, we got our little license, screw you, government, you can't be oversighting what we do in this. And it made us realize that that accountability that's there to be part of a world-leading forest industry, and why we need to have those checks and balances in place. Because while forestry has supported the province of British Columbia since its inception, we're obviously seeing the results of some of the poor forestry that has occurred well before any of you or I were dealing with some of these issues. But I think we just continue to see the evolution. So I guess a question I'd have for you as a First Nations person who's helped manage licenses, negotiate them, get them renewed, get them charted, where do you see room in the Forest Practices Board for starting to bring in First Nations issues or conditions of license? And I guess the example I'll use is Nanwakolas Council started a cutting-edge program called the Large Cultural Cedar Program, where our guardians went out and we literally GPSed and taped all the trees of certain dimension. It didn't mean that they couldn't come down, but we just wanted an inventory of all those trees. And as we got going, we realized that we can do all this work that we want internally in our communities, but if the license holders don't have some kind of obligation to work within that, that was a challenge, and the province wanted nothing to do with that. The province is like, no, if you guys are bringing rules in place, that's something for you to work out with the companies. And to all the companies' credit that operate in Nanwakolas Council territory, they all abide by the Large Cultural Cedar Protocol. But do you see room in the evolution of the Forest Practices Board for incorporating Indigenous laws and some policy practices into some of those audits?
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple parts to it, the way I hear it. One is around the current system, the current framework of the Forest and Range Practices Act, and how a licensee, and it's just fantastic as an Indigenous forester to see so much take up by our communities to actually become licensees and operate these tenures. And there's work that can be done within the current system with a stewardship plan and how foresters set the clear objectives for cultural heritage values, for example. It's in there, but it's about setting the objectives that become measurable and achievable and actually go and do that. And we've really had a challenge with the large number of, I'd say, non-Aboriginal foresters trying to tackle that, setting objectives about how to manage cultural values and resources in their operations. We haven't really seen a fulsome use of that area within FERPA. We're hoping to explore that at the Forest Practices Board in this year and next year to try and shine a light on that area and show, look, there was space there, but it turned into oh, my objective is I'll share my plan with the community and check that meeting box, and that's how you could carry on with your operations. And then it changes in different places where the relationship is stronger and you can start to achieve those goals. That piece is very interesting to me right now, but the more interesting piece probably is the evolution. Where can we go? And the Forest Practices Board has a pretty strict, clear mandate. It's legislated within Forest and Range Practices Act. That's why I know we can take a look at those avenues now. In the future, DRIPA says we've got the framework now that nations will stand up. You'll stand up your laws from your community, and they'll say, this is what our law says about this. Who's gonna identify it in an audit? Is that a role we would play when we're auditing? Is that a joint role we can do with guardians in the community? Is it something we defer to the guardians in the community and take that role up, and then we work collaboratively? Solutions like that are fantastic to explore right now, because we can only react as an entity in our structure right now. We can only react to the current law, but what we know DRIPA is doing is enabling the change in the law and that policy. I would add that beyond our strict structure of audits and complaint investigations, which we really check for compliance with the existing law, we also have special reports and special investigations. So last year, you might have seen we published a special report on landscape fire management, the growing issues around managing for wildfire. We also published on species at risk, habitat, and I raise those two items because what they both reflect is what we're trying to shine a light on to government is the shift to landscape level planning and its importance. A lot of FERPA objectives and how we achieve them go right down to the site level, and you're dealing with a cut block on its own, but it's not the cut block where the challenges really are. There's some things that you can identify and tweak and get better at, but it's really this landscape impact that we're having. And as we shift back, I guess, and spend energy on landscape level planning, it's a great time that we're doing it with a First Nations lens, because that perspective is what it's all about, the land base and the knowledge that's held about it, and how to set some new objectives for the landscape over the longer term that's going to build a resilient forest again, right? And maintain it at that level.
I'm glad you put it that way in the beginning of your comment and answer. We've seen guardianship programs start to flourish, not only throughout Vancouver Island, the coast, but throughout British Columbia as a whole. And I know that's a discussion we want to continue having as well. We empower our stewards to have that, eyes and ears out on the land. I really look forward to the opportunity of just joint learning on some of the things that are being brought in. And I think, the nature of the Forest Practices Board being, put in place by legislation and having legislative oversight on how you do your audits and, rules and policies in place, I think that's only helpful. And while I don't like to agree with much government policy and legislation, if we can't put clear rules in front of people, how are we going to get them to follow them? And that was something I learned during my part of the War in the Woods, and I see my friend Patrick Armstrong was with us in that War in the Woods, and there's the rhetoric between what the activists were saying versus what the industry was doing had to be managed and measured. And I think that's an important role of the Forest Practices Board, is to bring some common understanding for society on where some of these things are going, because we get into these debates about resource development and resource management, and we've got a great panel on aquaculture coming up later where the realities aren't even part of the discussion. And we watched that during Clayoquot Sound. I think it might have started in Stein Valley, maybe earlier to that, and then carried on to the Great Bear Rainforest, where First Nations have had the opportunity to work with government, work with industry, and work with conservationists. And there's a big difference between a conservationist and an activist, because conservationists understand the rules that are in play, generally support the development of rules in place so that we all understand them. But I think the other important point that you made was around spatial planning, because we can talk about something that sounds very subjective to us, that a forest company could take 4 or 5 different ways, but if we actually go through the spatial planning exercise, and this is applicable beyond forestry, obviously, but just some of your thoughts on, the roles you played in being part of that spatial planning and helping develop some of those stewardship plans and some of those things, and where do you see, you don't have a crystal ball. I know that, there has to be legislation in place for you to start to see some of these colors, but, just what some of your thoughts going forward on ways we can integrate First Nations laws and practices. In other places, we have conditions of license in other realms and other rooms that we talk about where First Nations, through impact benefit agreements or other regulatory agreements with industry, want to see certain things achieved. Where do you see some room for growth in that?
Yeah, I think the best avenue for us right now is immediate steps are every year we're actually boots on the ground in our investigations and our audits. So we're going out around the province wherever our random audits land. And so we're in nations' territories. And getting into the territory, there's a great opportunity immediately to have our auditors, our investigators become more aware of the nation's interests and values. And if there's a guardian program being established and there's some structure behind what the nation's interests are in the land, this is a fantastic time for us to be working and collaborating together. Our reports are independent. We want our reports to result in public recognition of what's going on and Indigenous recognition, and building that support and confidence that we've actually found some things that we don't like and we want to highlight them for improvement, or we can recognize where people are doing a good job and it's working, and we want to share that as well. So that's the immediate step, and we can only go that far right now, but it's better if we're up front and we're able to share what we're doing. I think there's room. We've had it already. I know in some nations have joined our audit team with their people, with their guardians and people to both learn both ways, right? How do we do a professional, unbiased audit and report it back clearly? The structure at the Forest Practices Board is that our auditors and investigators are professionals, this unbiased look, compliance with the law or non-compliance, identify their findings, and then our board of directors is separate, and it's another lens on the public interest, and how does it affect the public and our concerns in society, and what kind of recommendations are we going to make as a result of those findings, and how do we showcase that? And as a result of this structure where we have this very clear process and fair, it's a neutral, unbiased process, you can leave the politics out of it, and you can come back, and then you can have a lens of a group of people saying, this is what's really happening, and let's be strong with our voice about that and have some influential change. I'd love to start down that road where Indigenous nations, when we're in their territories doing this work, we can start to collaborate so we can understand how to get that voice as part of our work. And the medium term, hopefully it's not too long, as DRIPA comes down and starts to reshape legislation like the Forest and Range Practices Act and the Wildfire Act, then maybe that's going to change and evolve into how we can really collaboratively do that kind of governance and that independent watchdog role.
You know, this has been tremendous, and what I would like to do is, on behalf of Nanwakolas Council and the Hamaya Stewardship Network, is just formally ask you to meet with our stewardship office and just have that discussion and start that, because as DRIPA is coming in, you know, I've started to evolve my thinking around it, and I look at DRIPA and the federal version of it. I look at that as seeds that need to be planted, and I think we need to continue to do work to till that soil, so when those seeds are planted, it has the best opportunity to grow. So on behalf of BC IROC and Nanwakolas Council, I really want to thank you for your time today, and as usual, I just look forward to catching up with you and continuing talking forestry and First Nations values, and thanks for coming out, my friend.
Awesome. Thanks, Dallas. Invitation accepted.
Excellent, excellent. James, Heidi, you guys heard him?